Okay, good morning. Good morning and welcome. Okay, so let's talk about what we're going to be doing today. So we've got two things planned. The first is we're going to really settle in and work through a case in an effort to try and understand the arguments that the case is making and sort of draw out the principles that are being used. Okay, thanks for letting me know. And once we've done that, once we've sort of worked through that case, if we have time, we may not. Not every tutorial has, some of the tutorials have sort of just gotten through the case. And then we will sort of expand that conversation and try and look at how those principles play on a slightly larger game. Okay, so here's the case. I'm going to put it in the chat for you guys and then give you a couple of minutes to go and pull up your notes or the text or do some Googling and get yourself some things to help you understand, to help you talk intelligibly about the case. So the case is Walsh versus Lonsdale from 1882. And I'll go ahead and give you guys a hint. The Wikipedia article on this case is actually pretty good. It's, none of these are perfect, but this is actually, this one's actually pretty good. So I'll give you guys a minute. Okay, guys, so let's get started. For the latecomers, we're talking about the case Walsh versus Lonsdale. Okay, Walsh versus Lonsdale. So let's start with the facts, right? So what is the relationship between Walsh and Lonsdale that brings them to the courthouse door? Okay, and I want to be clear, and I'm going to cut you off if you answer it this way. I'm not interested in the arguments supporting the claim or what the court decides. We're building to that. Right now, I just want to know, what were these two people doing that got them into a dispute that led them to a lawsuit? Ashley says not paying rent for a lease which was not formed by a deed. That doesn't give me any information about their relationship, Ashley. I mean, I think nothing that you say is wrong, but I don't know anything at the end of that statement. So tell me, you know, what was the relationship that they had? Landlord and tenant, I mean, sure, great, okay, right, Megan. So all of you guys are right. Okay, you're not wrong. I don't want you to think that I'm telling you that you're wrong, but you gotta help your reader under or the person that you're talking to, like you gotta be able to help them understand why these people care. Okay, so you're absolutely right, Megan and Kanaya, um, that we have this mill, and Walsh and Lonsdale have a contract where Walsh is going to rent the mill for a 7-year period. What's the problem with that contract? Ashley mentioned it earlier. Deed was not executed. Why did it matter that the deed wasn't executed? Well, we're getting to that, Rayhan. So Megan, I mean, you're right, right? It makes the lease void, but why does it make the lease void? Right, Kanaya. Specifically, leases of longer than 3 years have to be created by deed. Okay, and that's the statute of frauds of 1535. Okay. Um, but that's absolutely right. Okay. You have to have the deed because of the length of the lease. Okay. Now, Rayhan makes the point that there's a provision in the contract whereby rent is payable a year in advance upon demand. So, landlord has the right to come in and say, I want a year's rent now and get it. Okay. So, Ashley made the point earlier that the deed was never actually executed. So, the contract says we create this 7-year tenancy. The contract acknowledges that in order to create this tenancy, we have to execute a deed. The deed never gets executed. Okay. How do the parties go along, in the beginning, right? What's the relationship look like? Is Walsh paying his rent? Right. He paid rent quarterly. Specifically, he paid rent quarterly in arrears. What does that mean? Well, we're getting to that, Rayon. You're right. He didn't, but at this point, right? This is just the very beginning. The demand has not been made. Right. You guys are sort of hitting around. You're saying the right thing, but you're maybe not saying it using the precisely right language. So paying rent in arrears just means paying it at the end of the period rather than the beginning. Okay. And this is relatively common in commercial relationships. Okay. Think about it. If you're renting a piece of property in order to run a business on it, you may not be able to pay the rent on that piece of property until you have possession of it and you can run the business to make the money to pay the rent, right? So that's not uncommon in commercial relationships. I will say I have been renting since I was 18 years old. I have never had a residential landlord agree to accept rent in arrears, because the whole thing is you're paying for the use you've already had. Okay, so you use the property, then you pay for it. But normally, and what may be more familiar for you guys, you pay at the beginning of the period for the use you're about to have. Megan, I'm not sure what you're asking. What do you mean by that goes for utilities as well? So I think that it is possible for utilities to be paid in arrears. In fact, I know it is because I've done that. I have done that, right? When but before I left the United States, my cable bill was billed in arrears. So I paid for the use that I had already had. Um, uh, so I can't speak to the specifics of a hotel, sort of paying their water bill after they reach a certain revenue point, but there's absolutely the possibility that utilities will let you pay in arrears. Uh, I thought my internet bill here was going to be paid in arrears, and then I got a bill for 2 months at the beginning of October for September that was in arrears, and October paid ahead. But that's neither here nor there. Okay, so um, so Walsh has been paying, right? He's been paying along, paying in arrears, and Lonsdale comes along, demands a year's worth of rent in advance, which he is entitled to do under the contract. Walsh says no. So what does Lonsdale do? Well, Lonsdale doesn't. Lonsdale collects, right? Okay. So if Lonsdale takes him to court, why is Walsh described as the claimant? Right. Lonsdale distrains Walsh's goods. Okay, so distrain is the verb form, the noun form is distress. Okay, what is distress in this context? Right, seizing property. Specifically, it's a common law remedy that's available to landlords to seize chattels belonging to tenants that are behind on their rent. It's exactly right. Exactly right, Ashley. So, Lonsdale distrains Walsh's goods. Sure. Let me repeat that. Distress, or in the verb form, Lonsdale distrained Walsh's goods, okay? Distress is a common law remedy that allows landlords to seize chattels belonging to tenants that are behind on their rent. Okay? Great. Awesome. So Walsh brings the claim for wrongful distress, right? Walsh's claim boils down to, hey man, you stole my stuff and you weren't allowed. Okay. So this is the point where we're going to step back and think about this a little more broadly. Because context matters. Your clients are going to come to you. They're going to say, I have this problem. But there's going to be underlying context that they may not tell you. They may not even know. And so you have to be prepared to think about how to ferret out this information so that you can fully understand your client's problems, because this is going to color how you can resolve your client's problems. Okay? So, what do you think changed? Right? This relationship goes on for a year and a half, almost 2 years, and Walsh is paying quarterly, everything's hunky-dory, nobody's mad, and then suddenly Lonsdale shows up and blows the whole thing up by demanding a year's payment in advance and then distraining Walsh's goods. Why would he do that? Why would he do that? Sure. Yes, right. Rayon just put the question into the chat. Why would Lonsdale show up and demand this money when he's been getting his payments quarterly and everything's been fine? And let me just sort of give the game away a little bit. There is no right answer here, because I'm asking you to get inside the head of someone who's been dead for 100 to 150 years, right? Not 150, but certainly 100. So there's no right answer here. What I want is, I want you to think about, like, why would you come in and demand the money if you were in Lonsdale's shoes? Right? What would be happening that would cause you to make this demand? Well, I mean, so there's absolutely a written agreement, right? There is a written contract, Stephanie. So it can't be that there's not a written agreement. The other thing is, you know, he's been getting his payments. So he's changing the nature of the relationship, and the status of the written agreement hasn't changed. So that can't be the cause, right? That's absolutely a reasonable argument, right? Lonsdale has some sort of financial issue. He sees, he's got a cash flow need, and he can't wait 9 months for the next for this money to come in. So he's got to get it out of whatever he can. Absolutely, that's reasonable. Okay. So he's starting to feel that Walsh may be becoming an unreliable tenant. Um, well, look, let me answer these, and then I want to come back to what Sydney said. Um, but you guys are right that he has the right to demand the money under the contract. Okay. This isn't a change in the terms. He absolutely has the right to demand a year's payment in advance. What I'm asking is, why would he suddenly do it 2 years in when he's never done it before? Okay, and I think, you know one explanation, like your classmates came up with, is that he's got a need that he has to come up with the money. But I want to talk a little bit more about what Sydney said, which is that he's concerned that Walsh is becoming unreliable. Why would you think, what might be going on that might affect Walsh's reliability as a tenant? Business for the mill is down, right? Absolutely. What might affect the business of the mill? Might be issues with the cotton supply, right? This is a time when the global cotton market's in a lot of flux. American cotton keeps sort of changing in its availability because of the American Civil War and Reconstruction, and the end of Reconstruction in 1877. Indian and Egyptian cotton is subject to other issues that present barriers, and so those are issues, right? Uh, Textile mills in England are more and more becoming unionized. This is only about 20 years after the massive Lancashire strikes. And so that's increasing the cost of labor that may make it more difficult to pay other parts of the supply chain. Um, so, so I think, um, if you ask me, what I think is happening here is that Lonsdale looks at this and he thinks Walsh is going out of business. And he wants to swoop in and snatch what he can and grab whatever money he can get out of this before Walsh disappears. Okay? So, yeah, this is the context, right? This is the broader issues that sort of cause this relationship to blow up, right? People don't just blow up business relationships that are proceeding along for no reason. There has to be something that causes them to do that. And that something, you guys are absolutely right that it could be that Lonsdale just has had some debt of his own called in, and he's got to come up with some cash. Um, but I think it's possible that there are larger structural issues in play here that are sort of hidden in the case. So now we understand why the parties are in court. right? We both understand sort of how their relationship proceeded and how it came to this point. We also understand the reasons why their relationship has deteriorated to the point where they're now in a lawsuit. So what is Walsh's argument for why Lonsdale couldn't steal his stuff? Right, right. Walsh says, look, we don't have a common law lease landlord-tenant agreement because we never did the deed, pun unintended. And so you can't make use of common law remedies, right? Here's the problem with that sort of standing alone, right? You're right that this is his argument, but this is not his entire argument. If this is his entire argument, then actually Walsh is a trespasser and he has no rights. So what's Walsh's argument for why he's actually entitled to possess the land, but Lonsdale isn't entitled to distrain the goods? You've got the second part. Now you got to give me the first part. What's Walsh's argument for why he's entitled to be in possession of the land? What is the interest in land that he says he has? Exactly right. That his tenancy was year to year rather than being for 7 years. Okay. The reason this matters is that yearly tenancies can be terminated with 6 months' notice. Okay. And so if Lonsdale had the right to demand a year's worth of rent or to distrain goods for a year's worth of rent, he could come in January, demand a year's worth of rent, walk out with it, and then come in February and say, oh, by the way, in 6 months, I want you gone. Okay? So this is Walsh's argument. I don't have the 7-year tenancy. I have a year-to-year tenancy. Because of how year-to-year tenancies can be terminated, Lonsdale has no right to demand a full year's rent in advance. So what does the court say? What does the court say? Does the court agree with Walsh? Right? The court rules for Lonsdale. Why? Sure, right? But why does equity require that we allow the lease to arise here? Well, specific performance is an element, but that's not the equitable reason. That's not the reason that equity gives rise to this. Equity regards that as done which ought to be done. Exactly right. Okay. So now I have read quite a bit about this case. I've read Professor Owusu's discussion of the case. I've read the very little bit that Professor Cotellini has to say about this case. I've read what Maudsley and Burns have to say about this case. I've read what Wikipedia has to say about this case. Nowhere do I feel like there's an adequate explanation of the court's logic. So let me unpack this for you a little bit. Okay. Right. That's another piece of what the court says. Okay. But let me unpack the court's logic for you. The court says we have this agreement, and this agreement says that you're going to do what is necessary to create the legal interest, to create a common law lease. You didn't do it. Now, we could order you to do it. We could enter an order that says, Walsh, Lonsdale, execute a common law lease. Do it. We could require that of you. But why should we jump through that hoop when we can just wave the magic wand of equity and declare that you have done it with regard to one another? And they say, look, Walsh, sure, you've lost all your worldly goods, and Lonsdale is selling them to satisfy a year's rent in advance. And, you're probably going to go to debtor's prison, although we don't know anything about that. But you're entitled to your full 7 years. You can't be dispossessed on 6 months' notice. You're entitled to your full 7 years. So this is how the court thinks that it is splitting the baby, so to speak. Of course, the problem with splitting the baby is, of course, now you've got half a baby. So does this make sense, right? Does this logic make sense that because there was the agreement to do something, and because the court could order that that be done, the court could just declare an equitable estate? Does this make sense? Sure, right? The agreement says we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Okay. If you did X, Y, and Z, you have a legal interest that is created. In this case, a lease. But you didn't do it. But rather than make you do it, which the court could do, the court is just going to say that you did it. I've literally just repeated myself, and I don't know if that helps. Do you need me to explain it a different way, or do you feel like you've got a grip? Okay. Let me see if I can explain it differently in a way that might be more helpful. Okay. Anybody in here play soccer? sorry, football. Sorry, football. Anybody in here play football? Okay, got a watcher. Okay, so there's only one person who watches it, then this is then that idea is a waste. Okay, so a couple of watchers. Anybody else want to chime in? I I don't know that this is a useful analogy for just 2 or 3 people, but okay. So let's take a stab at this and we'll see it. We'll see how it goes. An offsides call in football does not require that the ball go to the player that's offsides. Okay. You can, as the referee can make an offsides call for a player who's in an offsides position and affects the play. Okay, so let me pull up the whiteboard and sort of see if I can explain this in a way that makes sense, right? So we have our box, right? And we have our attacking player and the ball is here. We have another player here, another attacker who's offsides, and they pull the goalie to cover the angle in case the ball gets passed. And so what happens is you take a shot down the right side. This is offsides. The referee can call this and end the play, okay, and award a free kick, even though the play never goes through that player. This is what we mean by equity regards as done that which ought to be done. The ball could have gone to that offsides player, and that would have been an offsides play. And even though it didn't, it still affected the play by pulling the goalie off the angle. So now does it make more sense for Kishana and Megan who were still confused? Does that help? Great. Awesome. Okay. Last thing, and then we're gonna call it a day. Let's change it up a little bit. So everything is the same, except everything's the same about how the relationship goes, except Lonsdale drops dead. And Lonsdale Jr. is the one that shows up and demands a year's payment in advance, and then distrains the goods, and Walsh brings the claim for wrongful distress. Okay. So what result in that case? What result when the landlord is the son of the person who signed the contract? Who wins? Okay, why do you think the tenant wins, Ashley? Why do you think? So great, awesome. We have a disagreement. Ashley, why do you think the tenant wins? And Rayhan, why do you think the son wins? Since everybody's participating in chat, and that's fine. So you guys can make your comments in chat. Okay, but if the tenancy agreement remains the same, then why doesn't the analysis remain the same and the son wins, right? The son gets to keep the goods. In order for a different result, there has to be something that's different, right? So Rayhan's expressed the argument for the son that like the son inherits the property and all its rights. He has the same rights that Lonsdale would, and so he controls. But Ashley, if you think the tenant wins, I think there's an argument you can make there, but you got to identify what has changed. So remember, right? Equitable interests only affect those who know about them, which is why they affect the parties to the contract, but they don't affect bona fide purchasers for value without notice. Now, I've given you no facts to suggest that the son bought the land, so there's an issue there. But I've also, but there's things where you could argue that he has no notice. Okay, that he doesn't know. Maybe his dad just told him, "Oh yeah, go tell Walsh to pay you a year's rent." Don't and doesn't explain why. He just says, "Do it," and then arguably the son might not have notice. Okay. So do we feel like we understand how these agreements for legal interests create equitable interests? Do we feel like we've got a grip here? What questions do you have? Right, you'd have to, sure, right? If he doesn't have notice of the agreement, if the only thing he knows is that he has to go and make this demand and he doesn't understand why, okay, then he could argue that he doesn't have notice. Go ahead, Rayhan.
Yes, sir. So if let's just say, my father were to tell me that, but if let's just say I know, okay, he collects rent every year and whatnot, and this time, he said like, boy, I can collect a year from him and whatever, and he dies. That would not still be sufficient notice.
I mean, I think you could argue it, right? I think that if Lonsdale tells his son, "Oh yeah, I have this agreement with Walsh where I can go and demand a year's rent," then you can't argue it. Okay. But remember, the lack of notice is for Walsh to win. Because if Lonsdale Jr. has notice, then the demand is valid and he can, under the equitable estate, and he can claim the goods. Okay. If he doesn't have notice, then he doesn't have the claim. Does that make sense? Like this is one of the puzzles here, is that we're actually arguing that Lonsdale isn't bound by equity in order to argue that he loses. Right? So this is one of the puzzles of law. Hoo boy, what exactly qualifies as notice? Okay, let's go into it. There are three kinds of notice. Okay, one is actual notice. If you have evidence that demonstrates that someone actually knows of an equitable interest, they're bound by it. Okay. You can have constructive notice, which is where in deed registration systems, any equitable interest that is recorded in the chain of title is construed to bind future purchasers based on the fact that a reasonable and prudent person would go and would go through the registration system and make sure you understood the chain of title. And then you have imputed notice, which basically says if you are in this situation, you have notice. And to be perfectly frank, I don't have a great grip on the difference between constructive and imputed notice. But Justin, what I'm going to promise you is that I'm going to reread that section of the text when I'm in my office tomorrow, and I will explain the difference between constructive and imputed notice in the lecture tomorrow. Okay? Rayhan, you get the last word, and then we're gonna call it a day.
All right. So just like a hypothetical situation, just to see if would timing have any effect on notice? So let's just say if Lonsdale's son went a year with the regular quarterly arrangement, and then after the year he finds out, hey, he can claim, the 1 year's in advance. Would that affect it? Because technically you wouldn't know. Let's just say when Lonsdale died, he would have found out like a year later.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at that point he probably has notice. Yeah, because he's going to, like, there's not a story you can tell at that point where he is aware of this demand but doesn't understand where it comes from. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Then I'm going to let you guys go. I will see you tomorrow. Take care and bye.